Daniel Brooks opened his mailbox on a quiet Monday morning and found a bill for $48,000 waiting inside like a coiled snake. According to the Homeowners Association, the wooden barn standing on his property for more than 20 years was suddenly classified as an illegal structure built on shared community land. The letter gave him exactly 10 days to pay the fine in full or tear the barn down with his own hands. What made him laugh, quietly and without malice, was a simple fact that nobody on that board seemed to remember. He was the one who had hired the land survey crew that mapped this exact parcel years before any of them ever moved into the neighborhood. If the association president had bothered to open an actual map instead of simply issuing orders, she would never have pushed her entire board toward the worst legal disaster in the history of Brookstone Hills. Brookstone Hills had been built in stages over the decades, one cul-de-sac at a time, until it finally reached the edge of the old farmland that had once surrounded the entire county. Daniel's lot sat at the very last curve of pavement, where the manicured lawns of newer construction gave way to a wilder, older kind of landscape that had never been fully tamed by developers. He liked it that way, liked the sense of standing at the border between two different worlds, one shaped by committees and covenants, and the other shaped simply by weather and time. His neighbors on either side had lived there almost as long as he had, and over the years a quiet, unspoken trust had formed between them, the kind that develops slowly and never needs to be spoken aloud. It was a trust built on small favors and shared history, and it was exactly the kind of trust that made what happened next feel so deeply out of place. The house sat at the quiet edge of the neighborhood, where the paved streets gave way to open fields and the noise of lawnmowers faded into birdsong. Daniel had lived there alone for almost 15 years, ever since he retired from a long career as a structural engineer, and he had built a life that ran on quiet, predictable rhythms. His days followed a simple pattern of coffee at sunrise, work in the garden, and long afternoons spent reading on the porch while the wind moved through the oak trees. The barn behind his house had been standing since before most of his neighbors had even bought their lots, a simple wooden structure with a tin roof that had weathered 2 decades of storms without complaint. Inside it he kept a lawnmower, a small tractor he used for the back acreage, an assortment of garden tools, and stacks of seasoned lumber he was slowly turning into furniture in his retirement. There were no animals inside, no livestock, nothing that could remotely be called a farm operation, just the quiet tools of a man who liked working with his hands. Everyone on the street knew Daniel as the kind of neighbor who waved from his porch and never raised his voice. He mowed his lawn on schedule, kept his fence painted, and had never once received so much as a warning letter from the association in all his years there. When a storm knocked down a neighbor's mailbox, Daniel was the one who fixed it before anyone even asked. When the widow 2 houses down needed her gutters cleaned, he showed up with a ladder before her son could drive over from the city. He was not a man who looked for trouble, and he certainly was not the type to provoke an entire community board out of boredom. Anyone watching his life from a distance would have said he was the last person in Brookstone Hills who deserved a knock on his door from an angry official with a clipboard. He had built parts of the barn's interior, adding shelving for tools and a small workbench near the back window, where the afternoon light fell just right for detailed work. The tin roof had been replaced once, back when a hailstorm tore through the county and left dents across half the roofs in the neighborhood, and Daniel had done the repair himself rather than hire it out. He kept the structure painted a deep barn red that had faded slightly with the seasons, giving it a worn, dignified look that matched the character of the land around it. Children from the street sometimes wandered close to peek through the doorway at the old tractor inside, and Daniel would let them look as long as they promised not to touch anything sharp. None of this was hidden or secretive in any way, and any member of the association could have walked past it 1,000 times over the years without ever raising a single question about its legitimacy. That silence, in hindsight, would later become one of the strangest details of the entire dispute. That knock came on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, delivered not by a person but by the low growl of an oversized black SUV pulling into his gravel driveway. Daniel was trimming the hedges near his porch when the vehicle rolled to a stop, its tires crunching against stone with a kind of deliberate authority. The door opened, and out stepped a woman in her early 50s wearing a blazer far too formal for a residential street, her sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly been styled for the occasion. She surveyed the property the way an inspector might survey a crime scene, her eyes moving from the barn to the fence line and back again with obvious disapproval. Daniel set down his hedge trimmers, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked toward her with the calm, unhurried steps of a man who had nothing to hide and no idea what was coming. Her name was Victoria Hayes, and she had served as president of the Brookstone Hills Homeowners Association for going on 6 years, a position she treated with the seriousness of a mayor governing a small nation. She walked around the perimeter of the barn without so much as a greeting, snapping photographs on her phone and muttering measurements under her breath. Daniel watched her for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice even and unbothered despite the strangeness of the scene unfolding in his own yard. He asked her plainly what exactly she thought she was documenting, and she answered without turning to face him, saying only that this particular stretch of land technically belonged to the association. When he asked what proof supported that claim, she told him they had a map on file, though she made no move to produce it or even describe what it showed. Daniel pressed gently, asking if she could simply send him a copy so he could review it himself before anything escalated any further. Victoria waved the request away with a flick of her hand, telling him that the board did not owe explanations to homeowners under active review, as if the phrase itself carried some official weight. She continued circling the barn, occasionally crouching to examine the foundation, occasionally stepping back to frame another photograph on her phone. At one point, she muttered something to herself about how structures like this always seemed to appear when nobody was paying close enough attention. Daniel said nothing in response, choosing instead to watch her work with the same patient curiosity he might have shown toward a stray animal wandering through his yard. When she finally climbed back into her SUV and drove off without another word, he stood there for a long moment, replaying the strange confidence in her voice and wondering exactly where it had come from. 3 days later, the first letter arrived in an envelope stamped with the association's official seal, and its contents landed on Daniel's kitchen table like a verdict already rendered. The letter accused him of an architectural violation, an encroachment onto shared property, and unauthorized use of community land, stacking 3 separate charges on top of one another, as if volume alone could manufacture legitimacy. At the bottom, in bold letters that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inform, sat the number $48,000, described as a cumulative penalty for 2 decades of supposed violation. The letter warned that failure to pay within 10 days would result in legal action, forced removal of the structure, and additional fees that would only continue to grow. Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for any citation, any deed reference, any actual evidence beyond the assertion that the board had simply decided this was true. He found none, but he did find something else buried in the fine print of the property description attached to the notice. The parcel number listed on the official violation notice did not match his own lot at all, an error so basic that it would have been comedic if the financial threat behind it were not so real. Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the letter in one hand and his own deed in the other, comparing the 2 documents line by line under the glow of his reading lamp. The mismatch was not a matter of interpretation or a technicality that a good lawyer might argue around in either direction. It was simply wrong, a clerical error so glaring that it suggested nobody on the board had actually verified anything before mailing a demand for tens of thousands of dollars. He set both papers down, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself a small, private smile that had nothing to do with amusement and everything to do with the quiet confidence of a man who had just found his first thread to pull. Years of engineering work had trained him to trust documentation over declarations, to believe numbers and measurements long before he believed the tone of someone's voice. He remembered the original survey crew that had come through the property when he first purchased the land, remembered walking the boundary lines himself with the lead surveyor and signing off on every marker they placed. That memory alone told him the association's claim could not possibly hold up under any real scrutiny, no matter how confidently Victoria had spoken about a map she refused to show him. He also remembered, with a faint twinge of unease, that this was not the first time he had heard vague murmurs about the association quietly expanding its claims over shared boundary lines throughout the neighborhood. Other residents had mentioned similar stories in passing over the years, complaints about fences shifting slightly, or common areas growing wider than anyone remembered agreeing to. At the time he had assumed these were simple misunderstandings, the kind of small friction that exists in any community, but now he found himself wondering if there was something larger sitting quietly beneath the surface. He drafted a short, polite letter back to the association, pointing out the parcel number discrepancy and requesting the actual survey they claimed to be relying on. Rather than correcting the error or slowing down, the board escalated with a speed that suggested they had already decided the outcome long before any evidence was gathered. Within a week, Daniel received a call from an association attorney informing him that a formal inspection team would be visiting his property, followed 2 days later by a county code inspector who walked his land with a clipboard and a visibly uncomfortable expression. Wooden stakes appeared along the disputed boundary line almost overnight, driven into the earth by association groundskeepers without so much as a phone call to warn him. A laminated notice was zip-tied to his own fence post, declaring the area a contested zone pending legal review, as though his own yard had become a crime scene in a case he had never agreed to be part of. The county inspector who visited, a soft-spoken man named Roger Ellis, seemed noticeably uncomfortable during his walk across the property, glancing repeatedly at his own paperwork, as though something about the assignment did not sit right with him. He measured the barn's distance from the nearest boundary marker twice, checked his readings against a handheld device, and jotted notes that he declined to share in any detail. Before leaving, he told Daniel quietly, almost as an aside, that he had seen plenty of boundary disputes over the years, and this one felt different somehow, though he could not yet say exactly why. Daniel thanked him for his honesty and walked him back to his car, sensing that even the officials sent to build a case against him were beginning to feel the ground shift beneath their assumptions. That small, private admission stayed with Daniel longer than anything Victoria had said, because it suggested that the truth was already leaking out around the edges of a story the association had built too quickly and too carelessly. Word moved through the neighborhood the way it always does, in driveway conversations and quick exchanges over fences, and soon everyone on the street had heard some version of the story. Some neighbors assumed Daniel must have done something wrong, because surely an association wouldn't pursue $48,000 over nothing, while others quietly admitted they found the whole situation strange given how careful and orderly Daniel had always been. Victoria seemed to relish the attention the dispute was generating, and at the next general board meeting she stood before a room of nearly 40 residents and announced, in a voice loud enough to carry to the back row, that the association intended to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. She spoke with the certainty of someone who had never once been challenged and could not imagine a scenario where she might be wrong. A murmur passed through the crowd, some residents nodding along out of habit, others exchanging uneasy glances they would only discuss later in private. One older resident near the front, a retired schoolteacher named Nora Whitcomb, raised her hand and asked simply whether the board had considered getting an independent survey before pursuing such an aggressive fine. Victoria answered quickly, almost dismissively, insisting that the association's records were more than sufficient, and that questioning them only wasted everyone's valuable time. Nora sat back in her seat, unconvinced, and later that evening she mentioned to her husband over dinner that something about the president's certainty had felt performative rather than genuine. Other residents brought up smaller grievances of their own during the meeting, mentioning fence lines that seemed to have shifted slightly over the years, or shared spaces that felt narrower than they remembered from when they first moved in. Victoria brushed each concern aside with practiced efficiency, redirecting the conversation back toward the supposed urgency of reclaiming what she called rightful community property. By the time the meeting ended, a quiet unease had settled over parts of the room that had nothing to do with Daniel at all, and everything to do with a growing sense that nobody had actually checked the facts in a very long time. Daniel sat near the back of that meeting, saying nothing, watching Victoria's performance unfold with the detached patience of a man who had already decided how this would end. He did not raise his hand to argue, did not stand to defend himself, did not give her the confrontation she seemed to be hoping for in front of an audience. When the meeting adjourned, he walked to his truck, sat behind the wheel for a moment in the darkness of the parking lot, and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he had not needed in years, a name attached to a company that had once mapped every inch of his property down to the last inch of fence line. The message he typed was short and direct, and it read simply that it was time to survey the entire property again, properly, from scratch. The land surveyor arrived on a bright Thursday morning, driving a truck loaded with equipment that looked almost futuristic against the quiet backdrop of the neighborhood. His name was Grant Pierce, a man in his 60s with decades of experience, and a reputation for being meticulous to the point of stubbornness. He unloaded a high-precision GPS unit, a total station theodolite, boxes of archived survey records, and a set of original county maps that had been digitized years earlier for exactly this kind of dispute. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and Victoria showed up within the hour, standing at the edge of Daniel's driveway with her arms crossed and a look of open skepticism on her face. She told Grant loudly, so that anyone nearby could hear, that he was wasting his client's money because the association's own records already settled the matter. Grant did not look up from his equipment, did not argue, and did not offer her the satisfaction of a reaction, choosing instead to simply continue setting up his instruments with the calm indifference of a man who had heard every version of that sentence before. Grant had spent nearly 40 years in the surveying business, long enough to develop an almost intuitive sense, for which disputes were built on real confusion, and which were built on convenient assumptions nobody had bothered to question. He explained to Daniel, while calibrating his equipment near the tree line, that most boundary disputes he encountered came down to exactly this kind of situation, where an organization had simply repeated an old error so many times that it eventually started sounding like established fact. He set his GPS unit to reference the same satellite constellation data used by county recorders, ensuring that his readings would be difficult for any opposing attorney to dismiss as unreliable or biased. Between readings, he cross-referenced paper archives from the county recorder's office, comparing decades-old filings against the coordinates his equipment was generating in real time. He worked with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that speed meant nothing if the final report could be picked apart by a sharp litigator looking for any excuse to discredit it. Daniel appreciated that quality in him more than almost anything else, because he understood, perhaps better than most, that in disputes like this, precision was the only currency that ultimately mattered. For 2 full days, Grant moved methodically across the property, planting markers, taking readings, and cross-referencing his measurements against the archived county documents he had brought with him. He worked in silence for long stretches, occasionally muttering figures to himself or double-checking a reading against his laptop screen. Daniel stayed nearby throughout most of it, not hovering, not asking constant questions, simply observing the process, the way a man watches a slow and important machine complete its work. Victoria came by twice more during those 2 days, each time with less confidence in her voice, though she never admitted as much out loud. By the second evening, as the sun dropped low over the fields and the equipment began to be packed away, Grant finally turned to Daniel with an expression that mixed professional caution with something close to quiet amusement. He said simply that he had a feeling the association president was not going to like what these numbers were about to show. The preliminary results came back within a matter of days, and they confirmed something Daniel had already suspected but had never allowed himself to fully believe until he saw it laid out in precise coordinates. The barn sat entirely within his own property lines, not merely close to the boundary but comfortably inside it, without so much as a few stray inches of deviation in any direction. It was, by every measurable standard, exactly where it was supposed to be, exactly where it had always been supposed to be for the past 2 decades. But Grant's findings did not stop at simple vindication, because a careful and thorough survey rarely uncovers only one truth when there are irregularities buried in the ground. As he continued cross-referencing every marker against the historical county records, he found something that made him sit back in his chair and read the coordinates twice to be certain he was not making an error of his own. The association's own perimeter fence, it turned out, crossed several feet onto Daniel's land along one stretch near the back corner of the property. 2 decorative streetlights installed by the association years earlier stood planted firmly on soil that belonged, according to every legal document Grant could find, to Daniel and not to the community at large. Even more striking, a section of the community walking path, poured in concrete and maintained by association funds for years, extended directly across a slice of his backyard that no resident had ever questioned. Grant did not rush to share any of this with either party just yet, choosing instead to finish compiling a complete and airtight report before making any public claims that could later be picked apart by an aggressive attorney. He wanted every measurement documented, every historical record cross-checked, every possible objection anticipated and answered before a single word left his mouth in anything other than a formal report. When Daniel finally asked him directly how bad the situation actually looked for the other side, Grant simply asked him a question in return. He wanted to know if Daniel had any idea just how long the association had actually been encroaching onto land that was never theirs to begin with. Daniel admitted he had no idea, and honestly, he had never once suspected that the association's own infrastructure might be sitting on land that belonged to him rather than the other way around. Grant explained that based on the aging of the concrete used in the walking path and the installation records he had managed to pull for the streetlights, the encroachment appeared to date back at least 15 years, possibly longer. That meant an entire generation of board members had walked past these structures without ever questioning where the true boundary actually sat, simply inheriting assumptions from whoever came before them. It also meant that the very people now accusing Daniel of encroaching on shared land had been quietly doing exactly that to him, on a much larger and more expensive scale, for far longer than his supposed violation had even existed. Grant recommended taking extra photographs of each disputed structure before finalizing the report, anticipating that visual evidence would matter enormously once this reached a courtroom. Daniel followed him around the property for another hour, watching him document streetlights and fence posts with the same careful patience he had shown toward every measurement so far, and feeling, for the first time since this ordeal began, that the tide had genuinely started to turn in his favor. Daniel forwarded the completed survey report to the association within the week, expecting at minimum a moment of pause, some acknowledgement that the situation was more complicated than a simple violation notice. Instead, the board's attorney sent back a curt response dismissing the entire document, insisting that a privately commissioned survey held no legal standing against the association's internal records. Rather than reconsider their position, the board doubled down, filing formal legal action, seeking enforcement of the original fine, forced removal of the barn, and additional penalties for what they characterized as continued noncompliance. Their attorney, a sharply dressed man named Preston Wade, appeared supremely confident in every phone call and every filing, treating the entire matter as an easy formality he expected to resolve within weeks. Victoria herself seemed almost gleeful about the prospect of a courtroom showdown, telling Daniel outright during a chance encounter at the mailbox that she looked forward to seeing him explain himself to a judge. Behind closed doors, however, a handful of board members had begun quietly voicing doubts about the direction Victoria was steering the entire dispute. One member, a soft-spoken accountant named Philip Grady, asked during a private session whether it might be wiser to pause and independently verify the association's own records before committing more money to litigation. Victoria dismissed the suggestion almost immediately, framing any hesitation as a lack of loyalty to the board's authority rather than a reasonable request for due diligence. Preston Wade, for his part, billed the association handsomely for every hour spent preparing filings, motions, and correspondence, and had little financial incentive to encourage caution when confidence paid so much better. The association's reserve fund, built up over years from resident dues meant for pool maintenance and landscaping, began quietly draining to cover mounting legal costs that nobody outside the board had yet been told about. It was a detail that would later strike many residents as the most troubling part of the entire affair, once the full financial picture eventually came to light. Daniel only smiled, told her that he looked forward to it as well, and walked away without giving her the argument she seemed to be fishing for. The case moved onto the county docket faster than either side expected, largely because the sheer size of the disputed fine caught the attention of a judge unwilling to let it drag through endless procedural delays. During a preliminary hearing, the judge listened to both sides lay out their positions, the association leaning heavily on internal documents that were, upon closer questioning, revealed to be decades old and never independently verified. Daniel's attorney, a measured and unflashy woman named Karen Whitfield, calmly pointed out the parcel number error from the original violation notice, drawing a visible flinch from Preston Wade at the plaintiff's table. The judge, clearly unimpressed by the sloppiness on display, ordered that an independent survey be conducted by a county-appointed surveyor with no financial connection to either party. This was not the outcome Victoria had wanted, but it was far from the disaster it would soon become, and for now, the board still believed the facts were firmly on their side. Outside the courthouse afterward, Preston Wade assured Victoria that an independent county survey would ultimately support their position, since he assumed, without any real basis, that the association's long-standing claim over the disputed area must have originated from somewhere legitimate. Victoria nodded along, though something in her expression suggested a flicker of doubt she was not willing to voice out loud in front of her attorney. Daniel and Karen Whitfield walked to their car in relative silence, both of them aware that an independent survey carried far more risk for the other side than it did for them. Karen mentioned quietly that in her experience, boards rarely requested outside verification unless they were deeply confident, which made her wonder if Victoria genuinely believed her own claims or simply refused to consider the possibility of being wrong. Daniel had no answer for that, only a growing curiosity about which of those two possibilities would eventually prove to be true. He suspected, deep down, that it might be some uncomfortable combination of both. The county surveyor arrived several weeks later, an unassuming man with decades of government experience who approached the job with the same procedural indifference he brought to every assignment. He spent 3 days methodically remeasuring the exact same boundaries Grant Pierce had already documented, cross-checking every marker against the county's own historical filings without any input or influence from either party. When his findings were submitted to the court, they matched Grant's earlier survey almost exactly, down to fractions of an inch across every disputed boundary line. The barn was confirmed, once again and now with full governmental authority behind it, to be sitting entirely within Daniel's legal property. Far more damaging for the association, the county survey independently confirmed the fence encroachment, the misplaced streetlights, and the walking path extending onto land that had never belonged to the community. The report went further still, noting several additional structures built over the years that extended beyond the association's actual legal boundary, suggesting a pattern of encroachment that long predated this particular dispute. The county surveyor's report was formatted with the dry, procedural language typical of government documents, listing coordinates and deviations without a hint of drama or opinion attached to any of it. Yet its conclusions landed with far more force than any impassioned argument could have managed, precisely because it came from a source neither party could easily dismiss as biased. Karen Whitfield read the report twice before calling Daniel, wanting to be certain she understood the full weight of what had just been placed into the court record. She told him plainly that in nearly 20 years of practicing property law, She had rarely seen an independent survey align so completely and so unfavorably against the party that had requested it. Daniel listened quietly on the other end of the line, feeling something settle inside him that was closer to relief than triumph, a sense that the truth had simply been waiting patiently to be noticed all along. He thanked Karen for the update, hung up the phone, and walked out to stand beside the barn for a while, saying nothing to anyone, simply letting the moment exist without needing to celebrate it. The judge began asking sharper questions during the following hearing, his tone shifting from procedural patience to something closer to open scrutiny. He wanted to know how an association could confidently issue a $48,000 fine for encroachment while apparently never verifying its own boundary lines in return. Preston Wade attempted to argue that historical maintenance records justified the association's position, but his voice carried less conviction than it had during earlier hearings, and sweat visibly beaded along his hairline under the courtroom lights. Karen Whitfield, sensing the shift in momentum, requested access to any internal association records related to boundary surveys conducted at any point over the preceding 2 decades. The judge granted the request without hesitation, ordering the association to produce every relevant document within 14 days. It was during the search for those very documents that something considerably more damaging than a simple mapping error came crawling out of a dusty filing cabinet in the association's administrative office. Buried among old meeting minutes and yellowed construction permits, a paralegal working for Karen Whitfield uncovered a survey report commissioned by the association itself nearly 20 years earlier, long before Victoria had ever joined the board. That original survey, conducted at considerable expense at the time, had clearly and accurately marked the exact same property boundaries that both Grant Pierce and the county surveyor had since confirmed. In other words, the association had possessed accurate boundary information for 2 full decades and had simply failed, whether through negligence or convenience, to update their internal records to reflect it. Old email correspondence between former board members referenced the survey directly, with one message even noting that the fence line should probably be adjusted to match the accurate boundaries described in the report. Nothing had ever been done, the fence stayed exactly where it was, and over the following 20 years, new board members inherited outdated and inaccurate assumptions without ever questioning where they came from. Construction meeting minutes from the era when the walking path was poured even included a brief note about a boundary concern that was apparently raised and then dismissed without further investigation. The paralegal who found the documents, a diligent young woman named Alyssa Turner, had nearly overlooked the folder entirely, since it had been mislabeled and stuffed behind years of unrelated landscaping invoices in a cabinet nobody had opened in ages. She brought the folder to Karen Whitfield's office late on a Friday afternoon, apologizing for the delay, and explaining that she almost dismissed it as irrelevant before noticing the surveyor's letterhead on the very first page. Karen spent the entire weekend reading through every document inside, highlighting passages, building a timeline, and slowly realizing that the case had just transformed from a boundary dispute into something considerably more serious. She called Daniel first thing Monday morning, telling him that what she had found went far beyond simple negligence and edged uncomfortably close to a documented pattern of willful disregard. Daniel asked her what that meant in practical terms, and she explained that it strengthened his countersuit considerably, giving him grounds to argue that the association had known the truth for 2 decades and chosen convenience over correction anyway. It was, she added, exactly the kind of paper trail that judges tended to remember long after the hearing had ended. Victoria could no longer maintain her earlier confidence once these documents were entered into the court record, and her responses during questioning grew shorter and increasingly defensive. The judge, reviewing the timeline laid bare in front of him, asked a question that landed in the courtroom with the weight of a verdict already decided. He wanted to know, quite simply, why the association had continued pursuing an aggressive and expensive fine against a homeowner when their own internal history proved the boundaries had been settled decades earlier. Neither Victoria nor Preston Wade had an answer that satisfied the question, offering only vague references to institutional continuity and administrative oversight that sounded, even to casual observers in the gallery, like excuses grasping for solid ground. The energy in the room had shifted entirely, and it was clear to everyone present, including several board members sitting quietly in the back rows, that the tide of this case had turned completely against the people who had started it. Sensing the direction things were heading, Preston Wade requested a private settlement conference in an attempt to resolve the matter before a final ruling could be issued. Karen Whitfield agreed to the meeting but made it clear beforehand that her client had no intention of accepting anything less than full vindication after months of unnecessary harassment. In the conference room, Preston offered to drop the fine entirely and quietly close the case, framing it as a reasonable compromise that would allow both sides to move forward without further conflict. Daniel listened politely, then calmly explained that dropping the fine was no longer sufficient given everything the process had already cost him in stress, legal fees, and surveying expenses. He informed them that he intended to file a formal countersuit, seeking not only the cancellation of the original penalty, but full reimbursement for every dollar spent defending himself against a claim the association's own records had disproven for 20 years. He added that he also expected compensation for the damage done to his reputation within a community where neighbors had spent months whispering that he must have done something wrong. The countersuit, once filed, expanded the scope of the case considerably beyond a simple property dispute over a wooden barn. Daniel sought reimbursement for his attorney fees, the cost of both surveys, and additional damages tied to months of public harassment that had visibly affected how neighbors viewed him around the community. Beyond the financial claims, the countersuit demanded that the association formally relocate its encroaching fence line, remove the streetlights improperly placed on his property, and reroute the section of walking path that extended onto his land without authorization. Victoria's composure finally cracked during a deposition when Karen Whitfield walked her methodically through the 20-year-old survey, the ignored internal emails, and the string of decisions that had led directly to this courtroom. She grew visibly agitated, at one point raising her voice at Karen in a way that even her own attorney seemed to wince at from across the table. The gallery, filled that day with several curious residents from Brookstone Hills who had come to watch the proceedings for themselves, sat in uncomfortable silence as the president they had elected unraveled in real time. Nora Whitcomb sat near the front row that day, watching intently as Karen laid the 20-year-old survey and its accompanying emails out one document at a time, each one landing with the quiet inevitability of a door closing. When Victoria finally raised her voice, insisting that nobody could have reasonably expected her to dig through decades of archived paperwork before enforcing community standards, Karen simply asked whether reasonable enforcement typically began with a $48,000 fine and a 10-day deadline. Victoria had no answer for that, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of testimony. Preston Wade shuffled through his own notes, clearly searching for some objection that might soften the moment, but found nothing worth raising. Several residents in the gallery exchanged glances that carried an unmistakable mixture of vindication and embarrassment. Embarrassment not at Daniel, but at how easily the entire community had allowed one confident voice to steer them toward judging a neighbor without ever asking for proof. By the time the deposition ended, it was clear to almost everyone in the room that this case was no longer about a barn at all. When the final ruling arrived weeks later, it left no room for ambiguity or partial victory on either side. The court declared the original $48,000 fine entirely void, describing it as baseless and issued without any legitimate supporting evidence. The association was ordered to cover the full court costs associated with the case, along with reimbursing Daniel for his attorney fees and both survey expenses he had personally paid to defend himself. Beyond the financial penalties, the court mandated that the association relocate its fence to the properly surveyed boundary line, remove the 2 streetlights sitting on Daniel's property, and reroute the walking path away from his land within a specified time frame. The ruling further prohibited the association from pursuing any additional claims, fines, or harassment against Daniel related to the barn or any other structure on his property going forward, closing the door permanently on any future attempt to revisit the matter. In the months that followed, the changes around Daniel's property unfolded slowly but unmistakably. Workers arrived to move the association's fence several feet back onto legally correct ground, and the 2 misplaced streetlights were relocated to where they should have stood all along. The walking path was rerouted around the edge of his land, leaving a small strip of restored grass where concrete had once cut across his backyard for years. The barn itself remained exactly where it always had been, its wooden boards weathered by 2 more decades of seasons, standing as quiet and unremarkable as it had ever been despite the storm that had gathered around it. Neighbors who had once whispered doubts about Daniel began quietly pulling their own property deeds and old survey documents out of drawers, checking their own boundary lines against association records that suddenly seemed far less trustworthy than anyone had assumed. Nora Whitcomb was among the first to request a fresh survey of her own lot, and to nobody's great surprise, it revealed a small discrepancy along her side fence that had gone unnoticed for years. Other residents soon followed, some finding nothing out of place, others discovering minor errors that the association quietly corrected without argument or delay this time. Philip Grady, the accountant who had once questioned Victoria's rush toward litigation, was appointed to lead a financial review of the legal expenses the board had accumulated throughout the case. His report, presented at a following meeting, revealed that the association had spent nearly as much fighting Daniel in court as the original fine had ever demanded from him in the first place. Residents listened to those numbers with a kind of quiet disbelief, recalculating in their heads how many pool repairs or landscaping projects that money might otherwise have funded. It became one of the more sobering lessons the community would carry forward long after the legal paperwork had finally been closed. Victoria resigned from her position as association president within a few months, stepping down under mounting pressure from residents who no longer trusted her judgment or her account of what had actually happened. The two board members who had aligned themselves closely with her throughout the ordeal followed shortly after, their names quietly removed from the association newsletter without much explanation offered to the community. A new board was elected that spring, and one of its very first actions was commissioning a fresh, independent survey of every disputed boundary line in the neighborhood, determined never to repeat the mistakes of the previous administration. The new president, a soft-spoken retired nurse named Diane Foster, made a point of visiting Daniel personally to apologize for what the community had allowed to happen under the previous leadership. She told him, standing in his driveway on a cool autumn morning, that the board intended to publish the results of the new survey openly for any resident who wanted to review their own boundary lines without having to request it individually. Daniel appreciated the gesture, though he made clear he held no resentment toward the association as a whole, only toward the specific decisions that had led to his ordeal. Diane asked if he would be willing to serve on an advisory committee reviewing future property disputes, given his first-hand understanding of how easily good intentions could be overtaken by careless assumptions. Daniel considered the offer for a long moment before politely declining, explaining that he preferred his quiet life exactly as it had been before any of this began. Diane respected the answer without pushing further, thanked him again, and left him standing in his driveway much the same way she had found him. Daniel did not celebrate any of it in any visible way, did not attend the meeting where Victoria's resignation was announced, and did not seek out any kind of public acknowledgement for what he had endured and ultimately won. He simply returned to his quiet rhythm of coffee at sunrise, work in the garden, and long afternoons on his porch, the barn standing steady behind him just as it always had. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the fields and the wind moved gently through the oak trees, Daniel walked out to stand in front of the old wooden barn one final time before returning inside for the night. He ran his hand along a weathered plank near the door, feeling the familiar grain of wood that had survived 20 years of storms, arguments, and one very unnecessary lawsuit. A faint smile crossed his face, not one of triumph or bitterness, but something quieter and more settled than either of those feelings. He thought about how easily this entire ordeal could have been avoided if anyone on that board had simply taken the time to look at the truth before reaching for a fine. He thought about Grant Pierce's careful measurements, about the county surveyor's dry and unshakable report, about Karen Whitfield's steady patience through every hearing, and about the old folder of forgotten documents that had finally forced the truth into the open. None of it had required anger or spectacle, only the slow, deliberate accumulation of facts laid one after another until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. He thought too of Victoria, not with bitterness, but with something closer to quiet curiosity about how a person could stand so firmly on ground she had never actually checked. Perhaps she had simply inherited a mistake from someone before her and clung to it out of habit, or perhaps she had simply preferred the comfort of certainty over the discomfort of being wrong. Either way, the barn had outlasted her tenure, outlasted the fence line that had crept onto his land, and outlasted every confident declaration made against it without a single fact to support them. Turning back toward his porch, he said softly to no one in particular that sometimes the most valuable thing a person can hold on to is not a piece of land at all. It is the boundary line that truth quietly protects, long after everyone else has stopped bothering to look for it.